The old Ford rumbled down the desolate highway. Dust billowed behind, a ghostly trail in the fading light. John gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. He was late. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple. John shivered. The air, even inside the truck, had turned icy. He glanced at the crumpled map on the passenger seat. Almost there, just a few more miles to the cabin. He'd inherited the cabin from his grandfather, a man he barely knew. It stood alone, nestled deep within the woods, miles from any town or neighbor. John had only seen pictures, faded Polaroids tucked away in a dusty album. His grandfather, a solitary man, had spent his final years there, seeking solace in the silence. John was seeking solace too, though of a different kind. He needed to escape the city, the noise, the memories. The road narrowed, turning into a barely there dirt track. Finally, the headlights caught a glimpse of something through the trees, a shape, dark and imposing against the dying light. John stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching on the gravel. The cabin loomed before him, larger than he'd imagined. It was a two-story structure, built of dark weathered logs. The windows were dark, like empty eyes staring back at him. He walked towards the porch, each step echoing in the stillness. A rusted swing hung from chains, swaying slightly in the breeze. He found the key where his grandfather had said it would be, under a loose floorboard. The lock was stiff, protesting with a groan as he turned the key. The door creaked open, revealing a dark and dusty interior. John fumbled for the light switch. A single bare bulb flickered to life, casting long, grotesque shadows across the room. The air was stale and heavy, thick with the scent of dust and disuse. The next morning, John woke to the sound of birdsong. Sunlight streamed through the gaps in the curtains, painting stripes of light across the wooden floor. He felt a flicker of optimism. The previous night's unease seemed foolish in the light of day. He spent the day exploring the surrounding woods, breathing in the crisp air, enjoying the solitude. He found a small creek gurgling nearby, its water crystal clear. As he sat by the creek, listening to the gentle murmur of the water, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't realized he'd been craving. As evening approached, John returned to the cabin, gathering firewood on his way. He built a fire, cooked a simple meal, and settled down with a book. The wind had picked up outside, and he could hear it whistling through the trees, occasionally rattling the windows. He tried to ignore the sound, focusing on his book, but a nagging sense of unease crept back in. He told himself it was just the wind, just the isolation playing tricks on his mind. But deep down, a primal fear started to gnaw at him. Night fell, cloaking the cabin in an oppressive darkness. John sat before the fire, the flames reflected in his wide, worried eyes. He had tried to read, to distract himself, but the words swam before him. Every creak of the old house, every sigh of the wind against the windows, sent a jolt of fear through him. He found himself holding his breath, listening for what? He didn't know. He wished he hadn't dismissed his grandfather's stories so readily. The old man had spoken of strange happenings, of an unsettling presence that permeated the woods, particularly at night. John had scoffed, attributing it to an old man's fancies. Now he wasn't so sure. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. John jumped, his heart pounding against his ribs. He chided himself for being foolish. But the scratching came again, more insistent this time. It was definitely at the door. John's blood ran cold. He was sure of it now. He wasn't alone. He lay frozen in the bed, every muscle in his body tense. He listened, his senses on high alert as the scratching continued, rhythmic and deliberate. It wasn't the frantic scrabble of a small animal. This was something else, something bigger. A faint glow emanated from the hallway, illuminating a single, dusty boot. It wasn't the kind of boot one would expect to see in a remote cabin in the woods. It was a woman's boot, sleek and black, with a ridiculously high heel. John's fear momentarily gave way to confusion. He watched, transfixed, as the boot slowly retracted, followed by the gentle click of the door closing. Silence descended once more, but this time it was a different kind of silence. The scratching was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness that seemed to pulsate with an unseen energy. John slowly exhaled, realizing he had been holding his breath. He cautiously pushed himself up in bed, his gaze glued to the door. Who was out there, and why had they left? The hallway was dark, illuminated only by the sliver of moonlight spilling in from the window at the end. John peered into the darkness, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no sign of anyone. He listened intently, but the only sound was the creaking of the old house settling around him. He cautiously stepped out of the bedroom and into the hallway, his hand trailing along the wall for balance. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and something else, something vaguely floral and strangely out of place. He walked slowly towards the end of the hallway, his gaze scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. As he reached the window, he noticed something lying on the floor. He bent down to get a closer look. It was a handkerchief, a delicate lace thing that looked wildly out of place in the rustic cabin. He picked it up, his fingers brushing against the soft fabric. It was still warm. A single high-heeled shoe lay abandoned in the middle of the living room floor. It was the same style as the boot he had seen earlier, sleek and black, with a dangerously pointed toe. John stared at it, his mind racing. What was going on? Who was in the cabin with him? He cautiously approached the shoe, his gaze darting around the room, searching for any sign of its owner. He reached down and picked it up, his fingers brushing against the smooth leather. It was still warm, as if it had just been taken off. He stood there for a moment, holding the shoe in his hand, his mind awhirl with questions. Where was the woman who owned this shoe? Why was she here? And what did she want? He decided to search the cabin, hoping to find some answers. He started with the living room, checking behind the furniture, under the rug, anywhere a person could possibly hide. The night air was cool and damp against his skin. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the clearing. John stepped outside, his bare feet sinking into the soft earth. He scanned the clearing, his gaze darting from tree to tree, searching for any sign of movement. The forest surrounding the cabin was dark and silent, the trees like looming sentinels guarding their secrets. The only sound was the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant hooting of an owl. John took a step forward, then another, his heart pounding in his chest. He had a bad feeling about this. He should go back inside, lock the door, and call for help. But something was drawing him forward, compelling him to uncover the mystery of the woman in the shadows. Panic welled up inside him, threatening to overwhelm him. He was alone in the dark, lost and hunted. He had to get out of the woods, had to find his way back to the cabin, but which way was back? He spun around, his heart racing, but every direction looked the same. Trees, shadows, and the oppressive silence of the night. He stumbled over a root, falling to his knees. Pain shot through his leg, and he cried out, the sound swallowed by the dense woods. He pushed himself up, ignoring the throbbing in his knee, and pressed on, his fear lending him a burst of adrenaline. He thought he saw a flicker of light through the trees, a faint glow that seemed to beckon him forward. Hope surged through him. The figure took a step towards him, and John could see it more clearly now. It was a woman, her face partially obscured by the shadows of the hood she wore. But even in the darkness, he could see that she was beautiful, with high cheekbones, full lips, and piercing eyes that seemed to glow in the firelight. She stopped a few feet away from him, her gaze fixed on him with an intensity that made him squirm. He tried to speak, to ask her who she was and what she wanted, but his voice caught in his throat. He had never felt so much fear, such a primal, instinctive terror in his life. "You shouldn't be here," the woman said, her voice a low, melodic whisper that seemed to slither through the trees. "This forest is forbidden." John tried to speak again, but no words came out. He wanted to ask her why he shouldn't be there, what secrets the forest held, but he was paralyzed by fear.